Well, good morning and welcome to the first convocation of spring semester 2010. Before we begin, I think it's appropriate to extend appreciation to all of you for coming today. I particularly want to extend appreciation to the students who are taking convocation for credit. Your attendance certainly is key in the success of this program. I'd like to welcome all of the members of the faculty, staff, and administration who have joined us today. I want to extend a particular welcome to members of the community. We see a large number of members of the community today, and that's wonderful. In fact, if I could have the house lights up for just one quick moment, sorry. What I'm going to ask, sorry, could I have the house lights up for just one quick moment? Sorry, I didn't give you a heads up on this. That was my fault. I'm going to ask for those of you who are in the audience who are veterans to please stand. Thank you for your service. I suspected that we had more than a few of you out there. This convocation is near and dear to my heart. My grandfather served in the Pacific Theater as a combat engineer, island hopping during the Pacific Campaign. My father is a disabled Vietnam-era veteran. And Mr. Harrison's work to make people aware of the story of these brave patriots is something I deeply admire. I think anybody who is remotely familiar with history is familiar with the Bataan Death March, but I think many of us are less familiar with the hell ships and the forced labor that many of our American prisoners of war experienced, and I'm very excited to hear the remarks today. By way of introduction, my name is Jeb Brannon, and I'm the Director of Convocations, Orientation, and Parent Services here at Southern Utah University. I work for the Academic and Career Development Center, which is a branch of the Provost's office. Convocation is hosted jointly by the Provost's office and the Office of the President. So on behalf of the Provost and the President of the university, again, welcome to each of you. Students who are in the convocation class, please remember you need to be working on your reflection sheet during the question and answer period, and you'll need to turn it in when you leave. Students in the convocation class are required to stay for the duration of the question and answer period. And in fact, I know that many of them are interested in staying because it's probably worth mentioning that our speaker is speaking today and he asked that we not pay him, which is wonderful. In fact, what he asked was, can we give copies of his book, Autodidactic, free to the first 200 people who came in particularly, and to all of the students who are doing convocation. It's a book that he wrote specifically to help people understand how to learn better based on his personal experiences. And so very generous on behalf of our speaker. And I know that many of our students have some questions from Autodidactic. All the students have had the book for a while and have been reading it. I also want to make you aware that this evening at 6 o'clock in the Charwan Smith Center Little Theater, which is the one across from the bookstore behind the C-store, we will be showing Mr. Parkinson's film, and there is a $5 charge for that. Half of the proceeds for that film will go to the Service and Learning Center here at Southern Utah University. And so, again, a very generous donation. We're having some wonderful benefits, reaping some wonderful benefits from your being here. Thank you very much. That is at 6 o'clock in the Little Theater in the Charwan Smith Center across from the bookstore behind the C-store. I asked a student to do the introductions today, and so I'm going to turn the time over to him. Ryan White is a veterans assistant in the registrar's office and a decorated veteran himself. He is also a senior here at Southern Utah University. He's a former NCO of the Presidential Honor Guard. Ryan was stationed at the Pentagon and the White House during the 9/11 attacks. A few of his many decorations include the Global War on Terrorism Medal, the Coast Guard Commendation Medal for saving lives, and multiple letters of commendation. I have had Ryan in class. I think the world of him. Would you give a warm welcome to Ryan?
Wow. Hi. Thanks, Jeb, for that warm introduction there. I don't even deserve to be on the same stage as Mr. Parkinson here. It's my privilege and honor to introduce your speaker today. Just a little bit about Mr. Parkinson. He was born in New Orleans. He is a nationally known trial lawyer who is co-lead counsel in the Japanese prisoner of war case. He earned his bachelor's degree from BYU and is a graduate of the J. Reuben Clark Law School. He has law offices in Palm Desert, California, and has been practicing law since 1976. He is currently being vetted for a federal judgeship. Mr. Parkinson authored with Lee Benson the book Soldiers and Slaves, Abandoned by the White House, Courts, and Congress, and more recently was a producer of the film The Inheritance of War, also about the Americans held prisoner of war by Japan and their quest for reparations. In part, because of Mr. Parkinson's effort, this previously little-known historical account has received attention on major network television programs, national newspapers, and periodicals like Parade and People magazine. And sometimes the world spins faster than we'd like it to. And from the bottom of my heart, and as a veteran, I'd like to thank you for not forgetting our veterans that even made it possible for us to be here today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce James Parkinson.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'm extraordinarily humbled to have an American veteran introduce me, someone who has received awards in gratitude for his sacrifices. So I appreciate that introduction. I appreciate all of you being here. I feel at home here at Southern Utah University. You have a remarkable campus. I'm treated as family. President Benson and his wife Debbie are so kind to my wife and me, and Jeb, you've made this whole thing possible. You're probably saying to yourself, Mr. Parkinson, I've never heard of you, I've never seen you, but the truth is you probably have. How many of you watched the BCS football game, Texas against Alabama? I was the only person there of the 94,000 who had a Southern Utah University hat on. Today I want to talk about a subject that is extraordinarily important to me, and I think to the nation, and I think to you. But to get into the topic today, I'm going to have to take your imagination and let's go back in history to December 7th, 1941, a date that President Roosevelt said would live in infamy. Every high school student in America knows that on that day, the Japanese launched a sneak attack at Pearl Harbor. About 3,000 Americans were killed. It took about an hour to 2 hours. The part of the story you might not know so well is on that same day, about 8 to 9 hours later, the Japanese launched another attack, but this time on the Philippine Islands. Back in 1941, the Hawaiian Islands and the Philippine Islands were territories. They were both part of us. The attack on Hawaii lasted a couple of hours, but the attack on the Philippines was an initial bombing, a strafing, and then General Homa of the Japanese Imperial Army landed some 100,000 troops on the island of Luzon, and the war was on. A battle took place on the Philippine Islands. We had our most decorated, famous general there for years, allegedly preparing the island for the war. It was General Douglas MacArthur. He had great help. He had Dwight Eisenhower as his aide. But when the Japanese attacked and came down from the mountains, they overwhelmed the American troops and the Filipinos. And so as the battle raged on and the Americans fought and the Filipinos fought, they were pushed down to the peninsula of Bataan. They pronounce it Bataan, B-A-T-A-A-N. And as they fought, they had their rations cut by half and then half again. Their ammunition ran out, and President Roosevelt went on the radio. And the men at Bataan heard him. And he announced to the world that the ships were on their way, reinforcements were on their way to the Philippines, but it was not true. It never happened. And then in the middle of the night, General MacArthur, ordered by Franklin Roosevelt, left the Philippine Islands and headed for Australia. And the men were left to fight that battle. And they fought it bravely until April the 9th, 1942. And on that date, we had the largest surrender of American troops in our history. General King surrendered 10,000 American soldiers to the Japanese. And along with that, about 60 to 70,000 Filipino troops. Now, the Japanese had a different culture. They were not signatories of the Geneva Convention. They had the Code of Bushido, the warrior code, which simply said, you never surrender. There is no honor in being a coward. If you are cornered, you die fighting for your country. So when the Americans were surrendered, they were surprised by it. They decided that the way you treat people who surrender is you treat them like dogs and cowards because they're not fellow combatants. You see, if you're a Japanese soldier and you dishonor your family and yourself by surrendering, your name is taken off the rolls in Japan and your family is shunned. Now, when you have that many troops on a peninsula, you've got to get them somehow from the Bataan Peninsula up to Camp O'Donnell, some 84 miles away. How do you do that? The way the Japanese did it is they lined the men up in rows of 4. And a march began that later was referred to in history books as the Bataan Death March. And they marched the men for 4 to 6 days, depending on when they joined the march. April in the Philippines is hot. It's humid. They deprived the men of adequate water. They did not give them enough food. And because they thought they were cowards and dogs, they treated them accordingly, and they killed the Americans and the Filipinos for sport. If an American soldier broke rank and tried to get a drink of water from a ditch, he was shot. If his companion stumbled and he went to pick him up, they were both bayoneted. I've talked to men who have told me that they were standing next to another man on this march, and a Japanese soldier came by on a horse and a samurai sword, and for sport beheaded an American soldier. The worst story I heard from my clients about the Bataan Death March involved a man who came down with a malaria attack, started to shake and fell to his knees. A Japanese guard came up and he looked at one man and he said, dig a hole. He dug the hole. He said, put him in the hole. He said, I can't put him in the hole. He's alive. He said, I said, put him in the hole. He wouldn't do it. He shot him. He turned to the next man and he said, you put him in the hole. And they did. And then they shoveled dirt on that American soldier as he screamed that he was alive, and they buried him alive. To understand the enormity of the Bataan Death March, the awfulness of it, we need to do a little arithmetic. It was about 84 miles. The historians aren't really sure exactly. If you take the number of American soldiers and the number of Filipino soldiers who died on that 4 to 6 day march and divide one into the other, you had a dead body every 32 feet for 84 miles. That's why it's called the Bataan Death March. Well, they get to Camp O'Donnell. The dying continues at a horrible rate. They're not being fed properly. It got so bad the Japanese were concerned with the Filipinos, so they opened the gates and just let the Filipinos go back into the countryside, but not the American soldier. They were shipped off to Cabanatuan, and they were continued to be starved and beaten and mistreated. And then the war started to change. We had the Battle of Midway. We started to have a few American victories. Now, since the Japanese didn't surrender, they had a little problem back in Japan. the companies that ran the industries of Japan didn't have enough men to do the work. So some of the largest corporations in Japan asked the army if they could have American soldiers for slaves. And so the men were loaded up on ships and sent to Japan and turned over to names you know very well, Mitsubishi, Kawasaki, and 26 other companies. They were forced to work in the mines. They were forced to work on the docks and the railways, etc. And they went from 200 pounds to 98 pounds, and they were dying. And on these ships that later in history became known as hell ships, 1/3 of the men that got on those hell ships never made it to Japan. You know, they didn't mark the ships POW ships, so in addition to typhoons and the starvation and the thirst and all that, you had American planes and submarines bombing and torpedoing their own men unknown to them, and you had horrible deaths. Well, the war finally ended. The American soldiers were liberated from those camps, and when they were, the army came to them and said, "It's time to go home. Don't talk about what happened to you in Japan and the Philippines. Just go home, start your family, start your career." So that's exactly what the American soldiers did. And that happened, and we went on with life. A peace treaty was signed with Japan in San Francisco in 1951. And then something happened in 1999. In California, a law was passed that said that if you were used as slave labor in World War II by the Germans or their allies, and those companies are doing business in California, you could sue the company for back wages and interest. Second that law passed, we were approached, a group of us, lawyers, by a survivor of the Bataan Death March, and he said, "I want to sue the Japanese." So we filed the lawsuit. And by the time the publicity started to roll, we had over 1,000 plaintiffs. It was a simple case. It's called a tort case, T-O-R-T. If someone takes something from you, they've got to give it back if it's unlawful. If the Japanese corporations use you for slave labor, didn't pay you, and they made money from it, and they're now some of the biggest companies in the world, they ought to pay you your wages with interest. Simple concept. We filed the lawsuit. We were very optimistic because the cases that were filed against the German companies ended in an $8 billion settlement. And we thought, if that's for people in Europe who filed in New Jersey, of all places, well, what about the American soldier? So we were very optimistic. Well, you can imagine, when you take on some of the biggest corporations in the world, you get incredible media coverage. So we had all kinds of media coverage. I'm going to show you a clip now of some of the media attention that we got. I want you to look at it because, among other things, you're going to meet for the first time some of the men who I represented. Please.
On this Memorial Day, the story of a group of American veterans who have turned to the courts and Congress to correct what they say is a 60-year injustice.
You're watching NBC4.
This Memorial Day weekend, the nation's top veterans groups have a special request. They want the public's help to support a bill to get compensation for a little-known group of World War II ex-prisoners of war.
This is Dateline Monday, June 5th.
You may have heard about the veterans who were prisoners of the Japanese and are now suing because of what they say was done to them in captivity. Well, tonight you'll meet a former POW whose story you have not heard, with a score he still wants to settle.
Broadcasting live for Dallas and Fort Worth. This is
the crimes of the Nazis are well documented, but some who were imprisoned by the Japanese say their war experience has all but been forgotten, and they want an apology from the Japanese government.
Germany was not the only country that used slave labor during World War II, as some American veterans know all too well. CBS's Barry Peterson begins tonight a two-part series on the forgotten heroes of Bataan.
This is News 4 Utah at 5:30.
Survivors of atrocities suffered at the hands of the Japanese army are seeking compensation. During World War II, a number of private companies in Japan used American POWs as slave labor.
From ABC News, tonight, a Memorial Day shocker. 2 huge Japanese companies. You buy their products. But are these companies linked to a horrible past? These American prisoners survived an infamous death march, only to be enslaved and tortured by Japanese civilians.
If Mitsubishi says they didn't use slave labor, they're lying.
Chief Investigative Correspondent Brian Ross chasing down Japanese executives about a dark chapter. Slaves to Japan.
What happened to Frank Bigelow and Mo Mazer and Les Tenney is a well-established but mostly forgotten historical fact of World War II. They are 3 of some 20,000 American GIs taken prisoner in the Pacific and put to work as slave laborers for Japanese companies.
This issue is about companies that put us into servitude, took advantage of us, didn't feed us, didn't give us medical care, didn't pay us, and now they're trying to deny all responsibility.
And according to the veterans, the companies involved are connected to the giant Mitsubishi and Mitsui corporations, some of the biggest in the world, who have been named in lawsuits brought by the veterans.
I wanted some kind of justice.
Les Tenney first wrote to the U.S. government about bringing some kind of legal action just after the war ended in 1946.
But you were a soldier. Soldiers are captured, bad things happen. Isn't that just the course of war?
Anything the Japanese soldiers did to me was the cause of war. Being put into Mitsui's coal mine, that was not part of the war.
Many of those who survived are suing the Japanese government and industry for back wages and an apology.
I shoveled coal in Japan for almost 3 years. I shoveled coal 12 hours a day. I was never paid. I never got proper food. I never got medical care. I would like them to apologize to me.
Californian Terrence Kirk captured these photographs showing thousands of Americans forced into slave labor for Japanese companies. Now the surviving POWs want to sue those companies.
A slave never gets an apology. I want an apology. The slave is never given back his dignity. I want my dignity returned. A slave is never paid for his work. I want to be paid for the work I did.
Frank Bigelow's story is not only about survival, it's about justice he says is long overdue for thousands of World War II veterans just like him, who became prisoners in camps you've never heard of, like Omuta's Camp Number 17, forced to do hard labor for Japanese companies with names we all know very well.
It was a brand new camp. It really was.
So your first impression of the camp was?
Just not a bad deal.
But it didn't take long to find out what the real deal was. Though housed in a prison camp run by the Japanese Army, Frank and the other prisoners were delivered each day to a coal mine owned by Mitsui, one of the biggest business conglomerates in Japan.
We were working as POWs for the Mitsui company, slave labor.
How did you know it was Mitsui?
By the name on the front of it. At the mine it said Mitsui Mining Company.
Frank Bigelow spent 43 months in captivity, and now as 28 Tampa Bay Stacey Phillips reports, he continues to fight the Japanese for compensation.
They beat you and treated you terribly, and if you didn't work, they'd cut your head off. And if you showed any sign that you were trying to help somebody else, or you would start singing God Bless America, and they'd shoot you.
At one point, he came down with 3 different viruses, including malaria.
For 2 years, ex-POW Frank Bigelow was forced to work in a Japanese coal mine.
We kept them in business. The way we kept them in business, they took us and made slaves out of us and made us work the mines, work the railroads, and work the steel mills, and work all the industries.
While working in a mine shaft, Frank hurt his leg, later amputated by a fellow POW.
As a slave laborer in Japan, Frank Bigelow lost a leg in a coal mine accident, but found the will to survive.
It is that strength that brings me here today. Justice is long overdue for the thousands of World War II veterans. Excuse me.
For 3.5 years, Marine Frank Dillman was a Japanese prisoner of war. His sweat was poured into mining ore for the Mitsubishi Company, he says under torturous conditions. And now, that slave labor is the subject of a lawsuit.
You know, Mitsubishi is one of the fourth largest companies in the world. They could pay out $1 billion and wouldn't mean a damn thing to them.
For Harold Poole, the time he spent with the 20th Pursuit Squadron feels like yesterday. Abused and malnourished, he says soldiers struggled as slave laborers.
And had to walk 2 miles a day to work 10-hour day, to walk 2 miles a day back to the camp again, and then in the evening, oftentimes they drill us up and down the road before they let us into the compound to finish the day.
Last year, the men told their story on Capitol Hill. Called the Justice for United States POW Act, H.R. 1198 would allow the vets to sue Japanese corporations for compensation and an apology, including Mitsubishi, Mitsui, and Nippon. All companies doing billions of dollars of business in the U.S. Leading the charge, Congressman Mike Honda, a Japanese-American whose own family was sent to a relocation camp after the Pearl Harbor attack.
And I think that after over 50 years, these men deserve the day in court.
Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah, who lost a brother during the war, was on hand to support the two former POWs.
Can you imagine what these fellows went through, what their families went through? They lived through it. They have health problems to this day because of what happened.
I'm willing to forgive. I'm not going to forget. I'll never forget.
I'll fight as long as I can, because I know what we went through.
We're going down pretty fast, but I'm not dead yet. And there's a lot of us that aren't. And we're going to live till we do something.
They were so young then, some only 17. Now they wonder if they will live long enough to see justice, if the battling bastards of Bataan can finally raise their arms in victory. Barry Peterson, CBS News, Tokyo.
I've given this speech before probably 8,000 people, from New York to the D-Day Museum in New Orleans to Salt Lake in California, but I've got to share with you that every time I show that video, I get choked up and I have to sit for a second and compose myself before I talk again. You know, as a lawyer, you have clients. And sometimes your clients turn into friends. These men were my clients, they were my friends, and they're my heroes. If you don't think war and the brutality of the war stays with you or doesn't stay with you, Mo Mazer, who you said, if the Japanese say they didn't use us for slave labor, they're lying, he died. And a day after he died, I was on a conference call with all the key lawyers talking to the widow. And we were expressing our condolences when Mrs. Mazer said, as Mo was slipping away into the dementia immediately before he died, the last words he uttered on this earth were, "Stop beating me. Stop beating me." Frank Bigelow, we're going down pretty fast, but I'm not dead yet. He died. You know, the story of the leg being amputated because of that accident in that mine, what you didn't hear is when they laid him on that table, they didn't give him an anesthetic. And he looked at his best friend and he said, "John, just punch me in the face, knock me out, I can't take this." And his best friend made a fist and pulled back. And he broke down and cried. He said, "I can't hit you, Biggie, I love you." He's gone. Frank Dillman has died. Let me tell you about the case. We brought the case. We had some of the finest lawyers in America, from Greenberg Trarick in Washington, D.C., and Patton Boggs, and some of the top trial lawyers from the tobacco case. And we took on these Japanese corporations. And we ended up in federal court in San Francisco. It was quite a sight. You had all these Japanese corporations, 28 of them, represented by about 50 American lawyers. And on our side, we had our team We had some of our veterans there. And then Vaughn Walker, who is currently hearing the Proposition 8 case in San Francisco, took it under submission and ruled that we could not take the case any further because of some language, a one sentence in paragraph 14B of the peace treaty with Japan signed in 1951. He interpreted it to mean that an individual couldn't sue another individual corporation. Went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, they denied certiorari, case is over. Let me just tell you something.